Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. So glad you can join us here today. If you are listening to us on one of the many fine podcast platforms that the Lunch Hour can be found on, you can also watch us on YouTube. And if you're watching us on YouTube, you can take the Lunch Hour with you wherever you go, whenever you're out doing errands, in the car, jogging, walking your kids, taking a walk on your own. Just can check us out on one of the many fine podcast platforms at which you can find the Lunch Hour. Very excited to bring our guest on today. We've had an opportunity to talk to him about some things. We've talked to whistleblowers in the past here on the Lunch Hour. And you know that it's my philosophical belief that that whistleblowers, well, the Lunch Hour is essential, but whistleblowers are an essential element of any free society. We're going to be joined today by Tristan Leavitt. He's an American attorney. He's the current president of Empower Oversight, a nonprofit organization focused on enhancing independent oversight of government and corporate misconduct. He took on this role in March of 2023 after serving as a member of the Merit Systems Protection Board, where he was involved in adjudicating whistleblower retaliation claims. Leavitt has a rich background in legislative oversight, having worked for such prominent figures as Senator Chuck Grassley on the Senate Judiciary Committee, where he played a key role in advocating for whistleblower protection and investigating significant scandals like Operation Fast and Furious. Originally from Idaho Falls, Idaho, Tristan earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in political science from Brigham Young University and later obtained his JD from Georgetown University's Law Center. His career includes positions with the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee and the Office of Special Counsel, where he focused on whistleblower laws and reforms. Beyond his professional commitments, Leavitt is also active in local politics. He's running for office in West Virginia. We may get into that, though obviously we're not going to endorse candidates here, but we'll talk to him a bit about that. He resides in Charleston, West Virginia, with his wife and 5 kids. I know it's a lengthy bio process, Tristan, but we get to this. Let me start here, though, because I talk about this with regards to property rights and why property rights are important to me and how I got involved in the issue. It seems to me that the issue of property rights protection for me is as important as whistleblower protection is for you. How did you get involved in it? Why is this your cause d'etre?
So I had worked a little bit on Capitol Hill for an individual congressman before law school. And during law school, I took a couple classes on congressional investigations, but it really wasn't until I actually started with Senator Grassley before I graduated from Georgetown. So I was doing both at the same time and for my final semester. And I started right as the original ATF whistleblower, John Dodson, had come forward about Operation Fast and Furious. And I'll be honest, before then, I don't know that I'd given a lot of thought to individual employment protections, right? If anything, I'm generally of the view that it's harder to fire a lot of federal employees than it should be, maybe.
Sure.
But suddenly I was working day in and day out with first one and then a number of whistleblowers in Fast and Furious who were just so committed, so dedicated. They came forward just because it was their duty and they were patriotic citizens, right? And so they believed they owed it to the taxpayer, in this case to the family of Border Patrol agent Brian Terry, who had died because of the involvement of these guns. And so I was just so impressed with John Dodson and these other ATF whistleblowers. I thought anything I can do for the rest of my career to help people like this, I will. And that's really become my career ever since.
It's funny. Because I went down the same road, obviously, working on labor policy issues for a little while. I know how onerous the federal labor regulations can be. But at the end of the day, right, there are reasons why we have these laws, to protect folks. So if someone, for instance, raises an issue within the context of a union contract negotiation about back wages that are owed, and that person then finds themselves fired or finds themselves with conditions of employment that are essentially the constructive termination, right? In fact, let's talk about this. Let's talk about the issue. And I know this is not strictly federal employment law discussion, but let's talk about the issue of constructive termination within the context of whistleblowing, right? The idea that you don't necessarily need to be fired, but they create the conditions where you've effectively been fired or you can no longer do your job.
Yeah, it's as for federal employees, it's the same in the private sector, but that's the Merit Systems Protection Board that I sat on. That's basically what they've ruled, is that your job has to be so so untenable that they've created such conditions that you can no longer continue. And so then even if you leave, even if you resign from the agency or retire, that can be considered constructive termination. And of course, you see the whistleblowers are, end up in miserable conditions so often. I remember one of the last cases that I worked with in Senator Grassley's office, a woman who worked for the Bureau of Prisons. They literally put her in an office without a floor in
Oh
a
my God.
particular prison. And again, this was just purely because of issues she'd raised, clearly flagging, right, the waste that was happening, some decisions by a particular manager that would have cost taxpayers a lot of money. And so, but it's human nature for people to retaliate. And again, to make life hard on people that point out their wrongdoing. And so that idea of constructive termination is an important one in that area.
Were you at Grassley's office when Kerry Clark was there? We haven't played the Who Do You Know game. This may have been, yeah. No, anyway, I've known folks who worked in that office over the years. So let's talk about this, right? Within the context of the separation of powers, we have a federal branch. I'm sorry. We have an executive branch. We have a legislative branch. We have a judicial branch. The executive branch takes the laws that Congress passes them, turns them into regulation, turns them into the policies that we all deal with. Congress has the power of oversight, but talk about the important role that whistleblowers play in this.
Congress can't perform its functions without whistleblowers. So, September 17th right here is Constitution Day, right? The day that the deliberations on the Constitution ended, and that separation of powers and playing that checks and balances role is so important. But the federal government has become so large in a way that the framers of the Constitution would never have been able to envision. There is no way that 535 members of Congress can know what's happening among the 2 million federal employees or in all of the countless agencies and bureaus. And so whistleblowers have to play this key role. Congress has tried to address the issue by setting up inspectors general. In 1978, they made that pretty standard across all large departments and most larger agencies. It's not perfectly consistent, but even then, inspectors general are relying often on whistleblowers.
Sure.
And sometimes the IG system fails. It just is not a perfect system. So Congress has to know the conditions on the ground. If it's going to legislate, if it's going to exercise the power of the purse in funding, all of the appropriations for the executive branch, they have to know how that money's already being used. And whistleblowers are critical to that. A really early, I mentioned this on your show the other day, but a really early precedent for this that I love that became the basis for the National Whistleblower Day on July 30th was sailors who worked on a ship in 1777.
Right.
And they saw these abuses by the commandant. He was the head of the Continental Navy. And they went to Congress. And not only did Congress, which was risky for them to do, frankly, because the commandant's brother was on the Naval Committee in Congress.
Wow.
So, but they went, their disclosures were borne out. So it was clear these abuses were happening. And ultimately Congress passed a resolution saying it is the duty of all individuals to bring information to Congress to help us root out waste, fraud, and abuse. And I think that's been the important obligation of federal employees ever since, when they see something, to be able to blow the whistle.
It's funny because I'm about to interview somebody for See Something, Say Something Day with the Department of Homeland Security, and it sort of goes along with those things. I mean, it becomes ever more important, or increasingly important, as the size and scope of federal power grows, right? It's the power side of it, right? So two aspects, right? There's the spending side. So the more money that the federal government has to spend, the more money the federal government has to give to people, and then the more power that federal agency or the federal government in aggregate has, the more important these whistleblowers are, aren't they?
Yes, that's exactly right. And people, when you talk about trying to address, the scope of government or the size of government, and it's interesting because different members of Congress focus on different things. Some focus only on appropriations bills. Some focus only on, trying to reduce our national debt. All these are important issues, but what my experience is, people don't know the difference between X number of trillion and X number of, these, it's incomprehensible for us, our national debt and these other things. People can relate to, for instance, Grassley cut his teeth identifying like $800 hammer, $1,600 coffee pot. People get that and are like, whoa, that doesn't make any sense. Right. And so whistleblowers can help to bring forward these things that help build the public momentum for the bigger changes that need to happen.
Yeah, and that's just it. And pointing out the fact that if there is this abuse of power, that something has to be done, right? It's the folks who are seeing it firsthand, because in the end, right, an inspector general is not seeing this necessarily firsthand. Usually, it's secondhand or even thirdhand. But the folks who are witnessing it firsthand, those are the voices we need to hear from.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And there are so many examples in recent months and recent years. I mean, whistleblowers are the ones that bring the most critical information to us out of the government.
Yeah, and let's start to talk about that. Let's start to talk about it with Fast and Furious. Actually, something before we start to talk about it, let's talk a little bit about Empower Oversight and how that came to be. I think folks need to understand where that's coming from and what it is that you guys do.
So my first manager in Senator Grassley's office was a guy named Jason Foster. So he and I are both attorneys. I worked with them for 4 years before I went to the House Oversight Committee, where I investigated the Clinton email server, for House Oversight and Jason Chaffetz. And then as I moved into the executive branch during the Trump administration, he had talked to me, and we talked about this idea of starting a nonprofit to build up support for whistleblowers, because you hear people talk about draining the swamp or other things, but a lot of people don't understand the significance of whistleblowers. And so, I encouraged him in that. And in 2021, he did open Empower Oversight. And so when I, after serving for a year in that position on the Merit Systems Protection Board, I left to become the president. And Empower was created just purely to help provide the kind of support for whistleblowers we wished as congressional staffers they had on the other side. They often didn't have legal representation. If their cases were politically charged in any way, a lot of there are several other whistleblower groups, but often they wouldn't take them if they seemed to kind of have a conservative bent or be politically charged. And so we provide pro bono legal services to whistleblowers.
But to be clear, you guys don't take cases necessarily on it with someone has a political perspective. What you're getting at are these central, really important whistleblower cases, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's the issues where, again, we're of the view that protecting whistleblowers in any circumstance is helpful across the board. But, the first case as I came to Empower was working with Gary Shapley, the IRS supervisor on the Hunter Biden case. And, it wasn't for any political reason. He just thought that it was significant. The case agent, Joe Ziegler, who we've worked very closely with, is a lifelong Democrat. And so,
let's talk about that, because, again, setting aside the political ramifications, right? The party issues that are involved. You have the allegations against a prominent U.S. citizen that tax laws were not just bent, but severely broken. And you have agents who are trying to do their job, and they are prevented from doing their job because of political pressure from their higher ups. Again, it could be anybody, but the fact is that they need to do their job. Talk about this case and sort of where it went.
Absolutely. So the first thing that we realized, to give a little bit of maybe more boring background, but I think is important for people, is that there did not used to be protections for tax whistleblowers specifically. So as a congressional staffer, I knew there are only a handful of areas where Congress has limited where information can go within Congress. Usually Congress takes a very, a broad view of those things, but on taxpayer information, they've limited that. Ever since the 70s, kind of post Watergate, they've created very strict protections on where taxpayer information can go.
Sure.
In the late 1990s, the Senate Finance Committee was doing a series of hearings on the IRS during the Clinton administration. And as part of that, they passed a very specific whistleblower statute that said, of course, it's not just about people breaking the tax laws, because the IRS investigates that all the time. It's where there's evidence of misconduct or maladministration in the agency itself, the IRS or other federal agencies. And so Congress passed this whistleblower provision specifically to allow whistleblowers or federal employees who knew private taxpayer information to come to Congress. And so that's the statute that we used, because were it not for that, there's an argument that they wouldn't have been able to communicate Hunter Biden's private tax information.
Sure.
We used that to go to the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee, the committees who are identified in this provision. Initially, we weren't even able to share a lot of detail. We had to say, our client can't share all the information with us because we're not cleared to receive this taxpayer private information. It's protected under 26 U.S.C. 6103. So we said, we can't receive the 6103 information. So both Democrat Senator Wyden, Chairman Wyden, issued a letter to me and my co-counsel, Mark Lytle, as did House Republican Ways and Means Chairman, Jason Smith. And with those, we were able to get the information from the whistleblower, all the information about the case, and then go and do a proffer with each of those committees to say, here's what this whistleblower has to provide. Subsequently, the House Ways and Means Committee decided to do a full-length interview with him and with Joe Ziegler. And then that's what the House Ways and Means Committee ultimately voted to release to the world.
Well, remind everybody about what happened with Gary Shapley and his colleagues in terms of not the allegations necessarily against Hunter Biden, but when they started to raise questions about this, what happened with them at the IRS?
Well, initially, they were raising questions internally for a couple of years. And that, although there there weren't any negative repercussions to them. They just got no help from their supervisors. They're out alone on an island. They were normally you would have had Gary's special agent in charge interacting with the U.S. Attorney David Weiss. In this case, they said, no, you do all the interaction, because they knew this was a big controversial case. It was going to be a huge mess. So it wasn't until David Weiss, the U.S. Attorney for Delaware, learned that Gary had been blowing the whistle that there started to be all these repercussions. And Weiss intervened. He stopped Gary from getting a promotion internally. After the time that we came forward to Congress, then Gary and Joe and the entire team also got taken off of the Hunter Biden case. That was one of the other areas of retaliation that became very public. And that happened. They were taken off the case the very day that David Weiss's office offered Hunter Biden a plea agreement or an agreement that would have required no guilty plea whatsoever. So the sweetheart plea deal that everybody saw was version 2.0. Version 1.0 was an absolute pass.
Let me ask you this. Let me take a step back for a second. And let's talk about coincidences. I don't particularly believe in coincidences. So when there's an action and within, let's say, a 24-hour period, there is another action which could be construed as a response. And we're going to get into one of those cases with regards to a former Democrat now turned independent in a moment. But, to me, I don't believe in coincidences. I believe that, if you have X in government, right, and then you have Y policy decision that's made, and the two are very much have an interplay. Or what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts here on coincidences? There are folks who would say, well, it's just coincidental that David Weiss did this at the same time this plea agreement was reached. Your thoughts here?
I think having a healthy skepticism is one of the key attributes of an investigator. Same for an investigative journalist, same for a congressional investigator. So yes, it looked suspicious at the time. Then when documents came out, we saw exactly what happened behind the scenes. And so we could see that Hunter Biden's attorneys were going to the U.S. Attorney's office saying, hey, you have to do something. You have to try and stop this whistleblower. In part, that's part of the basis for the defamation case that was filed on Friday, which I can talk about in a moment. But it's clear from behind the scenes, now that it's come to light, it's clear that it was not a coincidence. This was precisely because, same with the plea deal being announced just a couple of days before the whistleblower testimony became public. There was a rush to get this done because it was clear that once this came out, there were a lot of questions and they just wanted to box it up in a neat way with this plea deal. So not a coincidence. And I absolutely agree. Whenever you see something that looks, too good to be true or seems unlikely, it usually is. There's
I am always reminded, I don't know if you saw it, Brad Pitt in the movie Inglourious Bastards. Yeah, where I come from, we call that suspicious. I'm a firm believer in these. Well, let's talk about this defamation case because this is just filed, and as we're recording this, so this is big news. Let's talk about what's going on there.
Yeah, we heard all during last summer that from reporters and others that Hunter Biden's legal team were telling the Justice Department that Gary and Joe should be prosecuted, which was outrageous because, for one, it was clearly a form of retaliation. For two, they had done nothing wrong. Again, we very carefully abided by these laws. My co-counsel and I are experts in the tax law, in congressional whistleblower protections. So eventually Congress confronted. They sent a letter to Abbe Lowell asking about these communications behind the scene, and he responded with all of these past letters. And he said with those letters, in which they were, again, telling the Inspector General, U.S. Attorney Weiss, the Deputy Attorney General's office, these guys committed felonies and should be charged. He said in that letter to Congress, which would otherwise be privileged, that he was also releasing all those materials publicly. And we know that got sent out to the press. And so Mitch Langberg is the lead counsel on this. He's a very experienced defamation attorney. He's represented Steve Wynn in a $20 million jury verdict. Originally $40 million by a jury, but lowered by a judge against the Girls Gone Wild creators. I mean, he's a very, very experienced defamation attorney. And the reality is you can't go out there, as we put in our pleadings, you can't be out there and claiming that someone committed a crime, when you know better. And so it's a very significant case. And, Gary and Joe have every right to bring this. And
it's a situation in which I'm sure Abbe Lowell never thought that anybody would sort of turn around and do this. Again, this is the arrogance of the powerful in all of this. Let's pull it back, though. Let's go back to the Fast and Furious situation, because this was a case a lot of folks didn't quite understand what was going on. I was doing a lot of work with the good folks at Cam & Company. They spent a lot of time on this, but talk about that and how this sort of opens up the door and why we need to have these conversations.
Yeah, so John Dodson had been assigned to the Phoenix ATF office in the middle of this particular case, Operation Fast and Furious, already ongoing. And he saw the he saw that they were doing what's called gun running, right? They were aware that straw purchasers from Mexican drug cartels were coming into federal firearms licensees, purchasing large numbers of AK-47s. And to some extent, it's not unusual for people to purchase a lot of guns in Arizona, right? And people have every right to do that. But where there's evidence of criminal activity, I mean, they could see that people are paying in cash for these large numbers of them, and then they would go and hand the guns off to someone else.
Right.
And the ATF form 4473 says you can't do that. You can't buy for someone else.
Right.
So very early on, it became clear. The FFLs, the gun dealers, were getting cold feet and saying, we don't want to do this anymore. It looks very suspicious. But ATF encouraged them to keep going, saying,
right,
don't worry, we've got this under control. What John Dodson saw was they didn't have it under control. All they were doing was letting them go across the border and then tracing them when they were recovered at crime scenes.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very big deal for John Dodson after the death of Brian Terry to decide Congress needs to know about this. There was another U.S. attorney in Arizona at the time, Dennis Burke. He'd worked for Janet Napolitano, and he went and met with the Terry family, and he didn't disclose at all the connection of Operation Fast and Furious, even though he was very familiar with the strategy and he had signed off on it. So this case ultimately led, of course, to the removal of the entire ATF chain of command from the head of the Phoenix field office all the way up to the director. And it was just such a clear example of where Congress's oversight was necessary. Right. Without these whistleblowers, Congress never would have known about this. Even when Senator Grassley first sent that first letter to Attorney General Eric Holder, they denied that it was happening. And right. He had to write back and say, we've got a whistleblower, we've got documents. It's very clear to us it's happening. Holder ultimately had to withdraw that letter. And then Holder ended up being held in contempt of Congress because he was unwilling to produce the documents that were associated with this case. So it's just such a clear example of the importance of whistleblowers, the importance of congressional oversight, and of the need, frankly, for stronger repercussions. Holding right. Eric Holder in contempt, it was the first time the top DOJ official had been held in contempt, and it became clear that just sending a referral to the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia wasn't sufficient to get them to prosecute him. And Congress has seen that more in recent years as there have been more interactions between Congress and the Justice Department fighting over documents. No,
and that's absolutely true. Let me go here. Actually, something. Let's go to let's go to this DOJ congressional spying case you guys are involved in, because again, this gets into these issues of separation of powers and the importance here. Talk about that.
So after I was already in the executive branch, I was at the Office of Special Counsel, but again, Jason Foster was still working for Senator Grassley. And so early in 2017, the first kind of Russiagate stuff cropped up, and Congress was doing oversight of the Carter Page FISA application. And the Justice Department had sent information about that to several committees, and some of it had leaked out. And so the Justice Department, however, rather than even looking within its own ranks, apparently, sought communications records on congressional staff. And we only learned about this because about a year ago, Jason got a notice from Google telling him that it had now been unsealed. But again, that his communications back in 2017, those records of the communications were obtained. So they could see who he called. They could see if he calls Senator Grassley, they can see how long he's on the phone with him. Again, they didn't have the substance of the record. The key concern in addition to the real clear separation of powers questions, is that whistleblower phone numbers were turned up on those records. That's conceivably a way they could root that out.
Yes.
And so what we've been trying to figure out is, did the Justice Department, flag this in any way for a court? Because they had to get approval to subpoena these records, to go through them. And it seems very unlikely to us that they did flag for the court that these weren't just any communications.
Hold on, Tristan. We know that the Justice Department people at the Justice Department would never use their power to sort of go after their political opponents in this way. I mean, we know that they would never do that, would they?
Never. If only we'd known at the time, right? I mean, This is, again, going back, this is coming after a lot of stuff from during 2016, right? Yes. This was a more maybe naive time in history when we
have to know these things. I mean, that's just it, right? A more naive time in history, because we just had this happen. Getting back to the issue of coincidences, let's open up and talk about what's going on with Tulsi Gabbard in her case.
Sure. So in late July, Tulsi went on an interview with Laura Ingraham, and in there she talked about what a terrible candidate Kamala Harris was, and that she thought it would be detrimental to the country if she were elected. And the very next day, Tulsi Gabbard was added to a TSA watch list called Quiet Skies.
This is crazy to me, but yes.
Yeah. The Quiet Sky's been around for ever since kind of the underwear bomber in about 2012, but it used to just be that it resulted in enhanced screening through the airport
Right.
and some, bomb sniffing K9 teams, et cetera. Well, in 2018, the federal air marshals were added as a component of this. That if you're added to Quiet Skies, they monitor you on the flight. You'll have 2 or 3, usually 3 air marshals on the flight with you, monitoring your every move. And the idea of the program, it's different from the terror watch list, where there's an actual kind of reason to believe that someone might need to be monitored. Not everybody on the terror watch list is banned from flying. It's so-called no-fly list, as we call it. So air marshals do go on flights and give what's called special mission coverage. And that's, I don't know that they've ever caught anybody that way, but I can see the predicate for that. In this case, Quiet Skies is just purely based on, supposedly, your travel patterns and other things like that. And that's their ostensible reason. But again, for Tulsi Gabbard to be added the day after this interview, again, is extremely suspicious. Yes.
Right.
So
exactly.
It's really hard to buy. And of course, it wasn't just one flight. There were at least 8 flights that TSA had air marshals following her for. And it just seems like such a clear waste of money, an abuse of authority for them to do that. We had whistleblowers from within the air marshals came forward and flagged this. And we know that they were immediately put under investigation by TSA. Ultimately, we've been able to brush that back. But this is just such a clear example of again, an abuse of authority by those that have the power to do so.
We need to know, because we've got to make sure that our government, starts with, we got to make sure that our taxpayer dollars are being spent wisely. We got to make sure that as we hand over this power, right? I mean, you think back, and I don't know how much of a student of history you are, Tristan, but I am a student of history. I have an understanding of the intelligence community. You think back to the abuses of the FBI and CIA back in the 60s and into the 70s. And we had this Church Commission, led by Senator Frank Church, which looked at this, right? To me, one of the great lessons of the 60s was, and the failures of the 60s was that when power is being abused, well, then that power needs to be wrenched from the hands of those that are abusing the power. And to a certain extent, that's what the Church Committee tried to do. But it seems that these powers come back and they're allowed, this sort of is allowed to fester and grow. Let me get your thoughts on that idea.
I absolutely agree. And it's interesting. I wish I had it right in front of me, but I actually quoted from the Church Report a few months ago, because there's a section in there where he talks about how the IRS have been used to look at conservative groups for their tax status. And it could have been written in 2013, right? It could have been the lowest learner, all of the stuff there. And but yeah, the IRS was at the heart of that. The FBI, all of those were things that the Church Committee looked at. And like you say, if you don't have, they tried to, the FISA process came out of that. The FISA process was supposed to be a way to, as a reform, and it's clear that it hasn't worked. So again, the checks and balances have to be effective, but you have to have ongoing oversight, and it's clear it hasn't worked sufficiently there.
And these are ever more important, especially in an era in which folks are not held accountable when they abuse the process. It used to be, right, if someone was caught with their hands in the cookie jar, they would issue an immediate apology. They would probably resign from office, and then the policy would be changed so that somebody couldn't put their hand in the cookie jar in quite that way. But really, a few years ago, this transformed into, now you don't have to resign. Now the wagons get circled. Now the power isn't changed, and people get promoted when they do these things. I mean, that was the astounding thing to me in the wake of the IRS scandals in the mid-2010s, is that nobody was really held accountable. And there wasn't, as I recall, much in the way of were there whistleblowers who came out about that? I don't remember. You might remind me of this.
No, it came forward from an IG report. Was what?
There we go. It was an IG thing.
Yeah.
People complain. They asked the IG to investigate, and the IG actually did his job. I mean, it's one of those things, again, where these processes are so important. A lot of the stuff that happens at the Small Business Administration is focused on loans and access to credit. But then you have the Office of Advocacy, which analyzes regulatory impacts. But you also have the National Ombudsman for Small Business, which is supposed to look at regulatory abuses. I mean, where does this go from here, Tristan? I know you guys don't lobby, but what are the holes sort of in the protection of whistleblowers? What can Congress or a new administration do to champion whistleblowers and change policies to make them better and even more effective?
We definitely advocate for whistleblower policy, and I'll give you an overview. But one area that needs it, or one agency that needs it more than any other, almost, is the FBI. Because in 1978, when the modern whistleblower protections were passed, kind of post Watergate, the FBI was lumped in with the intelligence community, largely just because of the remaining influence of J. Edgar Hoover. So they're no different than other federal law enforcement agencies, but they do not have the same whistleblower protections. And so a year ago, I testified in front of the weaponization subcommittee alongside 3 of our FBI whistleblowers whose security clearances had all been suspended. One of them, we worked with the IG we submitted a retaliation complaint. We were able to get his clearance reinstated this year. So I'll be testifying alongside him again in about 10 days. But we're very happy about that. And the inspector general will be there to outline what happened in their investigation. But again, the clear policy changes there on those are that, in general, the FBI is not covered. They should be covered by the Office of Special Counsel, that former agency of mine which investigates whistleblower retaliation. Then suspending security clearances has to be able to be considered by the Merit Systems Protection Board. There's an old Supreme Court case, Navy versus Egan, that doesn't allow that. But Congress can overturn that so that they can look at this for whistleblowers. Right. And then in terms of the consequences, this is really a significant one right now, because we did, at the tail end of when I was in Congress, we passed a law that said anyone found by OSC or MSPB or an inspector general to have retaliated, the agency is required to propose at least a 3-day suspension for the first one. If they have good facts, they should propose a lot more than that. They could propose firing them, but that's the bare minimum. And then for the second offense, they should propose firing them. Well, the FBI is excluded from that also. So even though there are these clear examples of retaliation within the FBI, that doesn't apply to them. So these are areas that Congress definitely should change, and you have to create consequences for retaliators. One of the main purposes of that defamation lawsuit is, obviously Hunter Biden's attorneys are not in government, but going out and as we point out in the filings, lying about breaking the law is significant. But usually it's such a David and Goliath situation, because
100%.
Abby Lowell or the government, they have such deep pockets. And so this defamation lawsuit is entirely being funded on public donations. So people can go to defendwhistlblowers.com and can donate there for cases like that. But we have to create consequences for people retaliating. If all you get is a slap on the wrist, or there's just corrective action for the whistleblower, what stops anyone from continuing to do that in the future?
Now, you raise an important point, something that I've talked about quite a bit. I worked for a nonprofit legal foundation very early on in my career. And the idea of having organizations, there's a really great network of these nonprofit legal foundations doing the work that you're doing, right? And it always comes down to, invariably, you have these plaintiffs who have been abused by government power, and they don't have the financial wherewithal to fight back. So they have to turn to organizations like yours, or the Institute for Justice, or Pacific Legal Foundation, or whatever, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about here, the idea of going up against the federal, and it takes years. Talk about that a little bit, please.
It takes a very long time for federal employees to go through the process. I mean, for Gary Shapley, we filed with the Office of Special Counsel in May of 2023. He still doesn't have a decision from them.
Wow.
And again, inspectors general, those reports take so long. And again, we those are an area where we know how long it takes. Doing defamation lawsuits is really kind of a new front. And that's part of why we have to fundraise so much, because I can represent for free. We can agree, and I can donate my time. I'm not a defamation expert, and the people that do that get paid a lot of money. So to do it right, to do it well, and to really create the fear in people who would engage in that kind of behavior, is very expensive. But it's worth the fight, I think, because again, otherwise it's such a broken windows issue, right? It's James Q. Wilson, it's New York City under Giuliani, right? And if you let people say, well, that's just a small one, we're going to let that go, or whatever else, you've got to be able to push back as much as you can on any of these in order to deter people from retaliating in the future. Because if you don't do that,
I'm going to butcher Shakespeare here, but in Henry V, it's the line: if we let little crime slide, how can we turn a blind eye to capital crimes when they're chewed, swallowed, and digested, and they present themselves in front of us? That's what we're talking about here. So let's shift gears. I don't want to confuse the issue, but you have put your name on a ballot. You're running for office in West Virginia. First of all, what's been the transition? A boy who grows up in the Northwest, west of the Rockies, you come to DC, you make the move to West Virginia. Talk about being a West Virginian by choice and making the decision to put your name on a ballot.
Absolutely. So my wife is from Charleston. So I first came here to West Virginia in 2005. Our oldest son was actually born here in 2007. And during my summers in law school, I worked at a law firm here. So we've had this foot in West Virginia for a long time. And after being in DC for so long, one of the things that was kind of hard to see was that you're always uncovering new scandals. Again, I started 10 years ago with Fast and Furious, and there's just always problems. And so we really, in part, had a desire to build. And there's just a lot of opportunity in West Virginia for improvement. And for more transparency and for other things like that. So our education system here, I have 5 kids, and they are all in public school except for one who has dyslexia. And she's receiving benefiting from an education savings program that allows her to be in a private school here. So there's some really great policies that have been put in place in West Virginia to help encourage people to come here. We're aiming towards a 0% personal income tax. But there's a need for experienced people to roll up their sleeves and dig in and try and help. And that's what I want to do. So it's been very well received. It's been a great experience, but I'm really excited to see what lies ahead for West Virginia, because again, we shouldn't be 50th in the nation in education. Right. People here deserve better than that. And I think we can see it change.
During COVID, we had to cancel a major trip that we'd had planned for our summer vacation. We wound up going to Beckley, West Virginia, and didn't make it up to Charleston. I wanted to, but we bopped around West Virginia. It's a beautiful, beautiful state. So a lot to do. And normally it's funny. I bring this up with most guests. My listeners are tired of hearing it, but I'm going to say it anyway, because I ask my guests to talk about their outside interests. I think it's important for folks to understand that folks working in policy and politics and doing this kind of work, that they're not one-dimensional. And I'm not going to say that you're one-dimensional, but I know, you've got this job, you're running for office, but when you're not doing this work, do you have any downtime? What are you doing when you have a little bit of downtime?
I'm very heavily involved in volunteering for my church. Again, a lot of my time, I'm just trying to make sure that I'm there for my kids when they need me. But when I really have the downtime, I love to read. I love history. Again, there's so much to learn from that. So many parallels, and those who forget history are doomed to repeat it, of course.
Hey, here's a weird little curveball there. I'm assuming you're LDS, and if you're not, correct me if I'm wrong. But where did you do your mission work?
So I served in London, England.
Oh, wow. And what was that? I mean, how was that? I mean, how was that sort of being abroad doing this work? I know it's, every country is different. We've had family, friends who just got back from South America. But from what I understand, everybody who goes and does these mission trips, they come back changed. How did your mission work change you?
It really, for one, growing up in a small town, rural town, right, I was exposed to so many different people, so many perspectives. And it really, I think, allowed me to better relate to others. And I will say it also helped on a political front. I was raised very conservative. I had the Washington Times weekly edition mailed to my house when I was growing up, like as a senior in high school, right? I'm listening to talk radio all the time, but being able to interact with people who have very different beliefs, right? If someone has an interest in learning about Jesus Christ, right? I taught someone who considers himself an avowed socialist, and but right. we're all children of God, right? And so I think just being able to relate to people regardless of what their political views are, and certainly that's one of the things that since then, being, just reasonably talking to people and finding that people are open to hearing new things. It's been very helpful in a political context as well.
I love it. We're going to try to do an interview with someone who's talking about this idea of bridging conversations. Tristan Leavitt, how do folks find out more about the good work you guys are doing at Empower Oversight?
Like I said, the best place right now that we'll link to that and share more about it is defendwhistlblowers.com. Our main website is also empoweroversight.org.
Empoweroversight.org. Well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Glad to be with you, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
This has been yet another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. If you're watching us on YouTube, please hit the like button, the subscribe button, leave a comment. If you're listening to us on one of those many fine podcast platforms, subscribe and do the same thing. Let everybody know about the Lunch Hour podcast. Have a great week, everybody, and please enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.